Okay, so today we're doing something a little different. We're going to peek behind the Iron Curtain, like really behind it.
Yeah, we've got our hands on a top secret KGB article.
And it's not just any article.
Oh no. This was written by Lieutenant General Zakharov, the guy who personally accompanied Khrushchev on his 1959 trip to the U.S.
So we're talking first-hand account here from Soviet intelligence.
Exactly. And what's really cool for you is this is what they were thinking, what they
Yeah.
believed, how they saw the whole thing.
Right, because you asked us to dig into this Khrushchev visit. From the Soviet point of view, their goals, the atmosphere, how they saw the Americans, what it all meant.
And you know right off the bat, this article is crystal clear. The Soviets thought this trip was a really big deal.
Like a great mission of peace and friendship kind of deal.
Straight up. Zakharov uses those exact words. He saw it as a chance to cool things down internationally and a huge win for the USSR.
Okay, so let's get into those Soviet expectations. The article lays it out. They thought this trip could totally change their relationship with the U.S. for the better.
Yeah, they were hoping for a radical turn, they called it. And they saw it as something that could reshape global politics, like really ambitious stuff.
And this joint communique that came out of the visit, that was a big part of their optimism.
Oh, yeah. The Soviets were really focused on that agreement to settle international disputes peacefully through negotiations. It fit right into their whole peaceful coexistence thing.
At least in theory, right?
On paper, for sure. But beyond the diplomacy, they had these very specific ideas about how they wanted to be perceived by Americans. We wanted to show off their policies, their achievement.
Kind of bust some myths about America.
Totally. They wanted to dismantle what they saw as illusions about American power and the way of life here. Like a double mission. Educate and persuade. And it wasn't just abstract ideas either. They were really intent on presenting this idea of the Soviet man.
Soviet man.
Yeah. They wanted to emphasize his wonderful qualities, they said, to counter all those negative images they saw in the American media. A whole image makeover.
And of course, let's not forget the ideology. Zakharov's pretty upfront about that.
Oh, absolutely. A major goal was to push their communist ideas. Sharply and fundamentally propagate, he actually says. So yeah, diplomacy and all. But they definitely had their ideological agenda front and center.
Which leads us to what they found even before Khrushchev landed. Zakharov says the Soviets picked up on a mostly positive vibe from the American public.
Yeah, and even from some in Congress. But of course, there were political calculations happening too.
What do you mean?
Well, it was an election year, right? So the Democrats were probably watching closely, maybe hoping to use the visit against the Republicans if it went south.
Ah, makes sense.
And on the other side, some Republicans were probably holding back a bit, waiting to see how it played out before jumping on board with Eisenhower's whole initiative. It was a whole political dance going on.
But it wasn't all cautious optimism, though, right?
Oh, definitely not. Zakharov actually details some pretty serious hostility coming from these rabid anti-Soviet congressmen and some reactionary organizations. He names the American Committee for Liberation from Bolshevism, the Knights of Columbus, that kind of crowd. And then there were some governors and even some of the military-industrial complex pushing back.
And some of those cold warriors were trying to organize a silent and cold greeting for Khrushchev, right? Really shows you how deep those ideological divisions ran.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is how much Zakharov focuses on the hostility from émigré organizations. Hungarians, Russians, Ukrainians, Baltic people, Polish. He says their leaders were super aggressive, almost inciting people to provoke the Soviets, even hinting at violence, which is disturbing.
Wow, that's intense.
Yeah, he names names too. Newspapers like Novoye Ruskoye Slovo and the Ukrainian nationalist one, Svoboda, they were really pushing that extreme viewpoint.
It sounds like a powder keg.
It was. He mentions leaflets from groups like the All-Russian Liberation Committee, the NTS, and get this, the State Department and the Soviet Embassy got actual threats.
From these émigré groups.
Yeah. So the Soviets were like, okay, this is getting out of hand. They actually went to the State Department to try and tone down the most violent protests.
They probably didn't want their whole visit going up in flame.
Exactly. So that brings us to the American side of the preparations. Zakharov makes it clear that they saw a lot of it as basically propaganda.
Really?
They noticed the State Department was worried about Khrushchev's speaking ability, that he could really connect with the American public.
He was charismatic, right?
Supposedly. So Zakharov says they tried to counteract that with a preemptive PR campaign to make Americans suspicious of anything Khrushchev might say.
Oh, so plant that seed of doubt early on.
Exactly. They even mentioned specific radio and TV broadcasts warning folks about Soviet propaganda. And it wasn't just broadcasts.
What else?
They saw all these negative articles, cartoons in the press. Even Nixon's line about out-arguing Khrushchev or die made it into the article. It was a whole framing effort to make him look bad before he even got here.
Interesting. And they even thought there were unofficial instructions given to journalists and photographers to focus on the negative.
Oh, yeah. No friendly interactions, just the bad stuff.
Yeah.
And supposedly, they even tried to stage a thing where American workers would refuse to shake Khrushchev's hand.
Really? How'd that go?
Sakharov says it didn't quite work out.
Yeah.
But yeah, a whole visual narrative they were trying to create.
Trying to control the message.
Totally. And they noticed the provocative questions prepared for press conferences. Like super specific questions designed to put Khrushchev on the spot.
So that was deliberate.
That's what the Soviets thought. They even claimed that the State Department and this Institute of Government Affairs were cooking up these leaflets.
And what about those negative letters to the editor? Were those staged too?
Well, Zakharov notes instructions to newspapers to prioritize the bad ones. So they were definitely trying to shape the public's perception.
Okay, so let's talk security. The Soviets were super serious about it. Multiple KGB departments, meticulous planning. It was no joke.
Oh yeah, they weren't messing around. But to be fair to the Americans, Zakharov does say the State Department security folks and the state police cooperated. They even promised to protect Khrushchev better than their own president. Which is kind of wild when you think about it.
A little ironic.
Yeah. But then there's this whole other side to it. Zakharov was not impressed with the American police. Let's just say that.
Like how?
He calls them rude and tactless. He didn't like the crowd control methods, the barriers, the armed personnel with their backs to the people, and that motorcycle escort. He describes it like an erupting volcano, all these guys with guns on their hips. Apparently the Soviets even tried to suggest doing things differently, but it didn't go anywhere.
That's interesting. Different styles, different cultures, I guess.
Yeah, and maybe some underlying tension too.
So let's get to the actual arrival at Andrews Air Force Base. Zakharov makes a point of saying Eisenhower was right there to greet him.
Yeah, even before the engine stopped, apparently. Which, interestingly enough, wasn't in the American film about the visit. Makes you wonder what else they left out.
Trying to control the narrative, maybe? So what about the motorcade to Washington?
Seems like it was a mixed bag. Lots of crowds, people waving Soviet and American flags, which they noted. But they also saw the dark spots, as they called them. That silent greeting banner, some fascists with black flags.
Yeah, you can't please everyone.
True. And it probably pales in comparison to the overall reception, which they mostly described as enthusiastic.
So then first meeting at the White House, how did that go?
Seems like it started well. They exchanged those symbolic gifts, that pennant for the moon and the gold badge. Zakharov says Eisenhower was happy about them, but he noticed Nixon seemed uncomfortable.
Maybe some disagreement behind the scenes?
Could be. They also mentioned Eisenhower taking Khrushchev to his private quarters in the White House, which they saw as a big sign of respect.
It's those little gestures that can matter.
Exactly. And then there's that helicopter ride over Washington. Apparently they talked about modern art. Little moment of trying to connect on a personal level.
Makes sense. You can't just talk politics all the time.
Right. But then, at the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center, there was that turkey question.
Oh, yeah. What was that all about?
Seems like an attempt to provoke him, but Khrushchev had a witty comeback, at least according to Zakharov. What they were not happy about was that photo in Life magazine.
The one with the turkey?
Yeah. They thought it was totally misleading. Just shows you the propaganda war never really stopped.
True. Okay, so what about Khrushchev's speech at the National Press Club? That seems like it was a big moment.
Oh, yeah, big time. He was hit with all these provocative questions, that's what they call them. But he fired back, made it clear the USSR wouldn't be intimidated.
That earned him the nickname Iron Man in some papers.
Exactly. Zakharov even quotes positive reactions from some American and Canadian press. Seems like Khrushchev's directness resonated with some folks.
And it wasn't just in those formal settings either. Zakharov mentions the warmth and enthusiasm from ordinary Americans in places like Pittsburgh and Ames. People even shouting, "Nikita!" Must have been kind of surreal.
It was. Shows you that not everyone was caught up in that Cold War mentality. Some people genuinely wanted things to be better.
So then they hopped on a train to New York. And that's where things got a little dicey with that security threat.
Yeah, I remember Bella Fabian. They arrested him and then let him go. It was tense. Shows you the real dangers they were dealing with despite all the security.
And arriving in New York.
Bit chaotic, apparently. The motorcade was speeding. Then there was that whole thing with the elevator at the Waldorf Astoria. Khrushchev made a comment about American technology, which is classic him, always with the sharp remarks.
Never missed a chance.
Never. And then he had to address the Economic Club of New York, right in front of all those American business elites.
That's been interesting.
Oh, I bet. More provocative questions. But he kept laying out the Soviet perspective. It was a big moment for him to try and reach that powerful part of American society.
And then came the big one, his speech at the UN General Assembly,
where he proposed total disarmament. The Soviets were really happy with the positive reaction and all the people trying to get tickets.
A big diplomatic win from their point of view.
Big time. And it probably reinforced their belief that the world was ready for disarmament. Or at least that's what they wanted to believe.
He kept running into those émigré protesters in New York. But Zakharov points out something interesting. Some regular Americans weren't having it. They argued with them, even intervened sometimes.
Yeah, not everyone was buying the anti-Soviet message. A lot more nuance in the public reaction than you might think.
So, Los Angeles, that leg of the trip seems like it was more difficult. The tomato incident, the whole Disneyland thing.
The Soviets were convinced that the Disneyland cancellation was because the local authorities were scared of him being too popular.
They thought they were trying to suppress a positive reaction.
Totally. And then there was that awkward visit to the Can film set. Khrushchev was pretty blunt about not liking the movie.
Cultural differences on full display.
For sure. And then at the L.A. mayor's dinner, that Bury America quote came up.
Which he always denied saying in that context, right?
Yeah, he was adamant about that. And apparently, even the American reporters thought the mayor was out of line.
So maybe the constant pushback was starting to have an effect?
Maybe?
Yeah.
Zakharov even says Khrushchev gave Ambassador Lodge an ultimatum about the provocations, and after that, things changed a bit. They felt like they had more freedom to interact with Americans directly.
Interesting. So, San Francisco.
Much warmer reception. He even brushed off a lone protester with a wave of his hand. But he did get into it with some AFL-CIO leaders, including Walter Reuther. Really criticized them for sounding too capitalist.
He never shied away from a debate.
Never. And that walk he took in San Francisco, totally unscripted, but he was mobbed by dock workers. Everyone was super friendly. They even traded hats. A real moment of connection there.
Yeah, that's a great story.
It is. So the article mentions Des Moines quickly, but then focuses on Pittsburgh. Seems they got intelligence about planned protests there.
More émigré groups.
Yeah. But the police in Pittsburgh intercepted them, and Khrushchev got a really warm welcome from the locals and the workers at the Mista plant. There's this great quote from the journalist Joseph North about how positive it was.
Sounds like they were getting better at handling those situations, keeping things from getting out of control.
Yeah, but even in Pittsburgh, there were still some provocative posters up. The Soviets complained to the deputy mayor, and they got taken down. So the tension was always there, simmering under the surface.
So back to Washington, they had another security scare on the way, but Khrushchev made it safe and sound to Blair House, and then it was off to Camp David for those talks with Eisenhower.
Yeah, the ones that led to the joint communique, a huge diplomatic moment, maybe the most important part of the whole trip.
And the final moments.
He met with embassy staff, had a press conference and a TV address. Then it was wheels up. Zakharov says Khrushchev was in a good mood on the flight home, already working on his next speech. Seems like he felt it was a success.
So looking back, through this KGB lens, the Soviets saw Khrushchev's 1959 trip to the U.S. as a big win for their peace efforts. Their peace efforts, of course. They thought he made a real impression on Americans, broke down some stereotypes, presented their version of the truth.
And they were convinced that Americans finally got a glimpse of the Soviet people. And of course, they saw Khrushchev as a master propagandist, really selling their message.
They admit that there was a resurgence of Cold War talk in the U.S. after he left, but they still believe the visit had a positive effect on U.S.-Soviet relations in the long run. And, Khrushchev got a hero's welcome back home. The Communist Party was thrilled.
So for you listening, what's the takeaway here? We've seen the hope, the suspicion, the propaganda from both sides, the good and the bad reactions to Khrushchev, and this unwavering Soviet belief that the visit was a success.
A really unique perspective. It makes you wonder, did all this, the planned stuff and the unplanned moments, really change the course of the Cold War? Even with all the tension and the ideological divide, did it create some understanding? Or did it just make the competition fiercer? It really shows you the power of direct contact, even between enemies, and how complicated it can be.